it was just this incredible feeling of love. And I was feeling more love than I'd ever felt in my life from my parents or a lover or, anyone. And I opened my eyes and I realized everyone around there was feeling the same thing. And he was just radiating that.
I'm Luke Story. For the past 22 years, I've been relentlessly committed to my deepest passion, designing the ultimate lifestyle based on the most powerful principles of spirituality, health, psychology, and personal development. The Lifestylist Podcast is a show dedicated to sharing my discoveries and the experts behind them with you. Check it out. If you're someone that's trying to curb carb and sugar cravings or get into intermittent fasting or even a ketogenic diet and have found it very difficult, I have the answer for you. They're called electrolytes from a company called Element. Electrolytes are not only great for when you sweat from a workout. Many people are familiar with some of the electrolyte drinks and things like that, which are normally full of a bunch of toxic sugar, corn syrup, artificial colors, etc. But electrolytes actually have many different purposes. And when I found this company called Element, I was stoked because it completely eliminated my food cravings after dinner. And that's when I typically like to fast. So I'll eat dinner and I'll fast until the next afternoon. It's no problem when I wake up in the morning the next day because I'll have a nice fatty drink that keeps me going. But it's that time in between dinner and bedtime that I've often struggled with. So I was incredibly stoked to find these electrolytes that just taste delicious and are very effective. In fact, I probably go through them faster than I actually need to because I just like the taste of them, legit. They're also great for low energy mornings when you wake up fatigued or with a headache or grogginess because you didn't get enough sleep or whatever reason caused you to wake up that way. Great thing to do is just pour a glass of water, put one packet of the Element electrolytes in there and just kickstart your day. They are very effective and I'm really happy to share them with you. So whether or not you're a hardcore athlete looking to recover or you're someone that just wants to cut down on certain types of foods or shorten your eating window, Element is the product for you. And here's what's great. These guys offer a totally risk-free money-back guarantee. They've also got a less than 0.5% return rate, which means no one's really returning this stuff because it works and it's delicious. If you go to drinkelement.com/Luke, they're going to hook you up with a sample pack for the cost of shipping, which is $5 on U.S. orders. Each sample pack includes 8 packets of Element. That's 2 citrus, 2 raspberry, 2 orange, and 2 raw unflavored. So go to drinkelement.com/Luke. That's DRINKLMNT.com/Luke. And this incredible offer is limited to one time per customer. When I was a kid, I was seriously addicted to sugar and candy. And even in my elder and hopefully wiser years, sometimes I still cave and end up popping in a gas station and eating a really toxic chocolate candy bar. Now, I've gotten better and better at that over the years because many companies have come out with delicious products that fulfill those cravings that are so deeply ingrained in some cases with things that are actually good for you. And that's why I was super stoked to find this product called Cacao Bliss from Earth Echo Foods. These guys have created a superfood chocolate raw cacao powder. It's got the cacao, some of the cleanest, most pure cacao in the world. It's also got turmeric and black pepper to activate that turmeric, MCT powder for some healthy fats and energy, cinnamon for blood sugar regulation, monk fruit as a very safe sweetener, a little coconut nectar as a prebiotic. Also has lucuma and mesquite, 2 superfoods that I've been really into for a long time and that are very hard to find in adequate amounts in products. And then they round this blend off with a little Himalayan salt. So what I like about this is that everything is, of course, organic, super high-end in terms of the ingredient deck. It's also really easy to mix into any kind of a drink, hot or cold, and it's quite portable as well. So you can take this powder anywhere you go and light people at that party up. If you are ready to get into some seriously decadent chocolate and superfood enjoyment, here is where you go, my friends. Well, you can click on the show notes. You'll see it there if you know what show notes are, or in this podcast description on your podcast player. Or you can just go to earthechofoods.com/Luke Story. That's spelled EARTHECHOFOODS. earthechofoods.com/Luke Story. The discount code there is Luke15, and that gets you 15% off. Again, that's earthechofoods.com/Luke Story. What an incredible episode we have for you today, folks. If you're a spiritual seeker or even spiritually curious, this might be the show for you. This is episode 339, Being Ram Dass, Remembering a Spiritual Master with Rameshwar Das. I recently got a hold of the new book, Being Ram Dass, and let me tell you, as far as spiritual memoirs go, this one is incredible. So I was really excited to sit down with its co-author, Rameshwar Das, or Ramesh for short, who's a writer, photographer, and co-author of several Ram Dass books, including Be Love Now, Polishing the Mirror, and of course the newest, Being Ram Dass. Ramesh was also one of Ram Dass's closest friends and confidants for almost 50 years, so the stories you're going to hear in this episode are absolutely incredible. In this expansive and multifaceted conversation, we discuss a slew of stories from the book and Ram Dass' life, as well as the following topics: what Ramesh's first trip to India was like and the miracles that he witnessed there, the various iterations of the life of Ram Dass, from a Harvard professor to a psychedelic cosmonaut, then devotee of his guru Maharaji, to finally becoming one of the world's most renowned and one of my favorite spiritual teachers. How Ramesh spent 10 years working on this book with Ram Dass after his stroke, and the grace with which Ram Dass navigated his own numerous and challenging physical ailments. We also discuss at depth some of the wildly harrowing and fascinating stories of Ram Dass's early psychedelic experiences and research. We also talk about whether or not Ram Dass ever tried 5-MeO-DMT and why he didn't discuss DMT much in general in the book or otherwise. Why and when Ram Dass eventually gave up using psychedelics in his spiritual exploration. The cities or spiritual powers of masters like Ram Dass's guru Maharaji, aka Neem Karoli Baba. The fascinating stories in the book about power trips between some of the famous Indian gurus like Muktananda and Satya Sai Baba. We also talk about Rameshwar's first visit to see Maharaji in 1970 and some of the spiritual phenomena he experienced there. Some of the most intriguing stories about Ram Dass's experience with Maharaji, and Ramesh also shares the details of one of my all-time favorite Ram Dass stories about the two occasions wherein he administered massive doses of LSD to his guru and what happened afterward. We also explore Ram Dass's deep work around death, grief, and attachment, and how his perspective ultimately impacted his own journey through the death experience. Ramesh also discusses how Ram Dass seemed to have avoided building a spiritual ego and managed to remain humble and authentic throughout his career despite his increasing fame. And finally, we discuss enlightenment as a goal and whether he considered Ram Dass to be an enlightened being at the time of his passing. In addition to these topics, we veer in and out of so many fun and inspiring conversation threads. So whether or not you're familiar with Ram Dass or not, this episode is sure to inspire you to expand your consciousness and what it means to live a spiritually centered life. So prepare yourself now, my friends, to be uplifted as we explore Being Ram Dass with the delightfully wise and funny Rameshwar Das. And as always, feel free to share this episode with a friend if you feel inspired to do so. Enjoy the show. Man, I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Well, it's really a pleasure. I'm glad you got to your destination so we could do that.
Me too, man. Thank you so much. Yeah, this is I did record one podcast here since I moved, but this is my first Zoom, remote one. So I'm glad it was with you. And for the people that are watching the video, I'm going to hold up this incredible book, Being Ram Dass, which you were a big part of creating. And I've been just like eating this book up. I took it to Mexico on a recent trip, and it's taken me a while to get through it. So I'm kind of skipping around a little bit, but it's so juicy. And I'm just so happy to have this conversation with you all about your relationship with Ram Dass and your experience with Maharaji and just the whole journey. It's
nice to have that book out in the world. I'm sorry Ram Dass isn't around to enjoy the fanfare and such, but it's been a long-term project, and it's got a life of its own now.
Yeah, it does. It does. And, think about all of the younger readers and the next generation of spiritual seekers that might have just become aware of his work or will in the future. And we have such a comprehensive account of his very interesting and unique life, which I think is such a gift, whether he's still around in his body to bask in that or not. It's just for the rest of us that are left here that are such fans of his work, it's incredible. So take me through a little bit of the process of writing the book. From what I understand, it took about 10 years of communication and hanging out between you two, and you sort of extracting stories out of him to create this narrative and put it together. I'm just curious, from a writing perspective, what was that process like? It sounds a bit unconventional.
Well, working with him, especially after the stroke, was pretty unconventional. He was a master storyteller before that. I remember talks where he would keep kind of threads of 3 stories going at the same time, and then they would all kind of knot up together at the end. And it was like, how did he do that?
Right.
But after the stroke, he had, the stroke was in 97, and he had complete aphasia for a while. I mean, he couldn't talk at all. And this is, someone who had led his life lecturing and teaching and on the road giving talks for decades. And suddenly he's brought to a complete stop, almost a dead stop, because they didn't think he was going to survive the stroke. And then he managed to keep going for another 20 odd years, which was extraordinary. I mean, it was, and he worked like hell to get what he could back of his speech and stuff. But he went really from being, there's this great line from Wavy Gravy from the Hog Farm and Seva, who said that Ram Dass went from being the master of the one-liner to the master of the ocean liner. Because he kind of slowed down.
Oh, man, that's funny.
So the process of working together was a little bit like that. And I am not the fastest typist in the world, but I was able mostly to keep pace with him as he spoke. So we would go back and forth, and I would write stuff down, and I'd read it back to him, and he would think about it and see if that was the way he wanted to say it and add more details. And we ended up with a pile of material, only about 2/3 of which is in the book.
Oh, wow.
And there were a lot of details and stories of, especially of his early life, which I didn't know. I mean, I met him when he first became Ram Dass, and I didn't know Richard Alpert, his earlier identity, at all.
Yeah. Wow, that's such an interesting way to write a book, especially just considering the impediment to his speech from the stroke. It's like having listened to, I don't know, probably hundreds of hours of his lectures at this point. Yeah. And then subsequently his appearances on, Raghu Marcus's podcast. What is the podcast called? The Ram Dass podcast. It does have a name. It doesn't come to me.
No, Raghu does one called Mind Rolling.
Right. But
the Be Here Now network.
Yeah. But then Raghu has the Ram Dass podcast where he plays the lectures and stuff, right?
Yeah.
And then he would periodically interview RD. I'll just call him for the sake of saving us breath. But he would interview him, for many years post-stroke. And I think you'd have to be someone who was very interested in his work and perspective and really understand who he was to kind of hang in there and have the patience to take in what he was trying to articulate.
Yeah, sometimes it took him a while. I think he described it as he was doing the speech therapy after the stroke. He said, the words were like clothes in a closet, and I had to go looking around to see which one I could pull out or to try on.
That's it. That's a really great analogy. So I'm curious. I guess this just is my lack of understanding about the aftermath of a stroke. But was his cognition also impaired in any way, or is it that he was still just as bright as ever, brain-wise, but just had a harder time actually articulating his thoughts and getting the ideas out just because of the speech, or was it a bit of both?
No, it was really the latter. His mind was pretty clear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at times he was, having to take antibiotics for infections and things like that kind of made him fuzzy. But he was really, his consciousness was curiously unaffected. And I think, whatever that, what do they call it, neuroplasticity, I think he found some new channels in there. And it also was, that real demonstration that consciousness is not just in the brain.
Right.
Because he was very present. But his, way of being changed from, somebody who was mobile and on the move and that constant interchange with people. He became much quieter and much more in his heart.
Mm-hmm.
And that evolution, which I think is really what, happened at the end of his life. And we started running retreats out in Hawaii, where he was living, because he basically was stranded in Maui.
Right.
Because he got sick again after the stroke in 2004. And that he got a UTI that got into his bloodstream, and it almost took him out again. So after that, he didn't travel much.
Yeah. I'd like to actually just back up for a minute. I started this conversation just assuming anyone and everyone, all the thousands of people that will eventually hear this conversation, already know who Ram Dass was. But perhaps you could give us just kind of an overview of his biography as a professor at Harvard until he was fired into the psychedelic research, going to India. Give us like a little bit of a timeline and to help, I think, create some significance for people that are as of yet unfamiliar with his body of work and his life.
Well, he was a generation ahead of me. He was born in 1931. And his family were, by then, pretty wealthy Jewish folks in Boston. His father was a lawyer who was a assistant DA in Boston, and later became a businessman and ran a railroad. And his wife came from a pretty wealthier family that had a carpet business. His upbringing, I think, was not the easiest. There was a lot expected of him. He had two older brothers, so there was this whole sort of sibling configuration in the family constellation that was, not always easy on him. And he chose psychology when he got to college. And I think largely because he was really having, a struggle with his own identity. And that identity theme really carried through the rest of his life.
Yeah, very much so.
That search for who he was on the inside.
Yeah.
So he's getting through college in the late 40s, early 50s. And psychology at that point was really still, kind of a fledgling science, especially social psychology, which is what he went into. There was basically otherwise Freudian and behavioral psychology. And he chose social psychology, which is a new field. He also got into clinical psychology when he got to Stanford, where he did his PhD. And brief aside, he did his master's degree in psychology at Wesleyan in Connecticut, which is where I went to school, where I met him. So
interesting.
Circle back to that.
Okay.
So he gets deeply into psychology, and he really became quite skilled at it. His fields in psychology were child development and achievement motivation. So he starts understanding about, what drives a human being a lot. And he started doing clinical therapy also at the, therapy student agency at Stanford. And then he continued doing that at Harvard. So he moves from Stanford to Harvard. And at Harvard, he met a new hire that had come into their department, a guy named Timothy Leary.
Yeah, what a fortuitous meeting. It's interesting, like the impact that the two of those knuckleheads had on our culture. It's incredible. I mean, there's no way to really quantify it, but what a meeting that was. Yeah.
No, and at the beginning they were serious scientific researchers, and this was Harvard. This was pretty staid academia. But quickly, both of them were pushing limits in different ways, and eventually they got fired from Harvard. But they continued their psychedelic researches up at this place in upstate New York called Millbrook, which was an estate owned by some friends who allowed them to use it for a base. And then along the way, I mean, things were sort of coming off the rails a little bit at Millbrook. Leary was getting persecuted, I think is probably the best word for it, by, the local law enforcement people, and the feds started getting on his case. And eventually he went to jail and escaped. Ram Dass, for some odd reason, never ran afoul of the law.
Wow,
and he could have, he was doing some pretty out there things along the way.
Yeah, like the taking groups of people to Mexico to take a bunch of acid and
that was all legal at that time,
right? Because that was in the research phase. Yeah, it's fun. I think it's funny to think for my generation and younger, it's hard for us to imagine that some of these things were not scheduled. Some of these substances at one point were just kind of under the radar, and then eventually got classified along with all of the hard drugs. Hopefully we're seeing, a reemergence.
I think we are very strongly.
So that's good news, but it's hard to imagine someone could have just flown with a big bottle of pure LSD in an airplane, just some of the stories, in the context of our time, you think like, wow, how did they get away with that? So it is interesting that he never had any scrapes with the law from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost as if he was, on a trajectory that was not of his own making, because after Millbrook came apart and he was living in New York, and he took up an offer from a friend to travel to India, and largely because they had gotten some hints through the writer Aldous Huxley, actually, originally. Huxley had brought them a copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And it became a model for psychedelic journeys. And that was the paradigm they used for the psychedelic experience book, which is still circulating in some later printings. So there was some feeling that people in the East might know how these planes of consciousness worked, that they were groping around with and didn't really know how to navigate.
That
was the search.
I want to interject one thing before I forget, and then we'll get on to the India, journey. But one of the funniest things in the book to me was the story, and it wasn't even a story; it's just a sentence that was talking about Aldous Huxley and his wife.
Yeah,
his wife had been with him at his bedside the moment he died, and he had requested that she administer LSD to him as he was crossing over.
Yeah.
It was just sort of an afterthought in the book, a sentence or so. And I thought, wow, that's heavy. That's heavy. That guy was hardcore. I mean, you think like, wow, okay, Aldous Huxley, sure. interesting character to say the least. But that particular tidbit of it, there's so many little nuggets like that. I'm like, wait, did I read that right? And then I read it again. I'm like, what a time, what a historical account.
Well, these people were all risk takers, and Ram Dass was definitely in that class, and he did some crazy stuff.
Yeah, with his airplanes and
I mean, flying a two-seater airplane on acid is not really.
You know what? It kind of
practice.
Like, there's parallels with and maybe they're even crossed paths or knew each other. But Hunter S. Thompson, right? I'm thinking of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It's some of the eras covered when it comes to the psychedelics and stuff. It's almost as if it was the Wild West, and one could get away with a lot of things that today would seem insane, such as just flying around your own airplane and crossing U.S. borders with drugs and all of these kind of things, and just that very just that American cowboy sort of bravado of just kind of doing whatever you feel like doing. But it reminds me kind of the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and just that kind of reckless abandon. Even though I know Ram Dass and his crew were not so much about partying, but really exploring consciousness. But it really is an interesting time to just reflect on.
When he got out to California, and he had known Ken Kesey, for instance, from Stanford.
Right.
And, those kind of joint enterprises that occurred out there. And he got very friendly with the Grateful Dead. And there was a lot of interchange at that juncture. And some of it got out of hand, clearly. And Leary was, Nixon at one point called him the most dangerous man in America, which was pretty laughable. It was sort of the basis, that was the beginning of the war on drugs, which Reagan and Nancy perpetuated.
Before I derailed you, you were getting into Artie's arrival in India. Take us back there. And this is where, in one way, the story really gets more interesting when he meets his guru. I mean, this is where real magic starts to happen. And the kind of the third iteration of Richard Albert emerges out of that.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think of his life as having, three incarnations packed into one. Basically, the psychology lifetime and the psychedelic explorations, and then the life with the guru and after that.
Yeah.
And there were those inflections. I mean, the first time he took psilocybin was such an opening for him. And he felt like I think his description was home in my heart. And he felt the same thing with Maharaji in a different respect. And it was, that description, which we went back over a bunch of times, of his first meeting with Maharaji, and this old man in a blanket who knows everything that is going on in his mind. And that completely changed his view. And there's an expression in, I don't know whether it's Hindi or Sanskrit, but the word is darshan in India, which means, I think the literal translation is view, but it's really about point of view. And when you meet a saint or, a higher being, you get that kind of look at things from where they're coming from. And that is like a reflection of your deepest being. And that was what occurred with Maharaji, with the guru, with this apparently rather simple man who was, more like a deity, really.
I think one of the many things that's interesting about Maharaji in terms of the other mystics and sages and gurus of India is, and I could be wrong and I just haven't discovered it, but there doesn't seem as if there was a body of work or teachings, that he created or around him. Whereas even like someone sort of obscure like Nisargadatta Maharaj, you have transcripts of his talks and things like that, where there's a book you can read that, explains the non-dualistic teaching, etc.
And Ramana Maharshi and
there's
Ramakrishna's gospel and so on.
Right, Yogananda. I mean, they've created organizations or temples or teachings, books, etc., or even videos in some cases of them teaching. And Maharaji, it's like, I think for many of us, his teachings have been sort of relegated to RD's interpretation and expression of them, of just us kind of trusting in his experience of that, Shakti, or that sense of unconditional love, and some of the powers or cities that he was able to demonstrate. But there's not like a lot to dig your teeth into.
You can't read about it. You can't join it.
Right, right.
You can't get initiated into it.
Yeah. And in the book, I think something that was really personally interesting to me are the stories about, in one of RD's trips to India, or I guess that was actually in the US, he got connected to Muktananda.
Yeah.
And that was interesting to me because when I was about 8 years old, I was taken by my mom to Muktananda's ashram in Oakland.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Wow.
and it had a really, which I think was a great karmic blessing to be a kid and just be in that energy field, despite some of Muktananda's kind of interesting things which we can discuss. But when I hear his name ever, I always perk up like, ooh, that was the first master that I probably was in the presence of.
Curiously, I was traveling to India in 1970 for my first time going there, and I was with Krishna Das and Danny Goleman, who were friends from Ramdas scene, and we met Muktananda, who was headed west.
Oh, funny.
In London.
Wow.
And somebody had told us to go see him and that he would be there. And then Ramdas met him in New York subsequently.
Right.
But, for me, it was kind of a revelation also because we were in a flat in London. And there weren't that many people. It was, maybe 20 or something. And people were bouncing around the room with Shaktipat, literally.
Really? Wow.
And, going into mudras and meditations. And he was very kind to us. He, gave us mantra and initiation and told us to go stay at his ashram when we got to India, which we did. We spent a week there when we landed.
Oh, that's so interesting.
He was very lovely, and but he was the first, being of that kind of different quality, who was a real yogi, and it was very powerful meeting him. And he was a very powerful being, as you probably sensed when you were around him. There was a real field of energy around him.
I think that it did have a big impact on me. I mean, my account of it is spotty. There are certain details I remember about the ashram and the experience, smells and sights and things like that that were subtle, not something that was said, but
pretty exotic for an 8-year-old.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I loved it. And ever since that, I've been really enamored with, I guess, Eastern mysticism and all things India in terms of the spiritual lineage, and have just benefited so much from so many of the teachers. But my mom said that when she took me up to get my blessing during darshan, that he looked at me and said, you have a very old soul. And I remembered I really got off on that. I was like, yeah, Mom, I'm no kid. I've got an old soul. And I reckon he was probably right. All these years later, I lived a bit. But it definitely had an impact on me. But I think something that's interesting in the book is how Ramdas had already met Maharaji, then got connected to Muktananda, started working with him a bit. And then his perception of Muktananda was that he was partially interested in power and would use his cities or his, these unique spiritual abilities in ways that were sometimes maybe even less than integrous. And that he noted a contrast between the energy field of Maharaji that was just completely outwardly giving and the expression of love and required nothing in return. There was no agenda. He didn't want anything. And that he sensed that Muktananda kind of wanted something, and he was vying for position as top guru and having the thing with Sai Baba and this little competition between them. And I think that's so interesting that someone can be enlightened, I guess would be the way we would describe that, and have access to these energies and be so high spiritually, yet still succumb to the humanness of feeding on that power. I've always found that interesting. I think if somebody can perform these siddhis, then they're closer to God and they have a clearer connection and access to those energies. And so therefore they would just automatically be above some of those lower, animalistic, ego-driven behaviors, right? It's always, I think I'm just spiritually gullible in that way. It's like,
well, that's, Westerners are, we have no exposure to that level of siddhis, powers and stuff. But Indian, it's not commonplace, but people are used to those stories, and it's part of their tradition. And but I always remember Ramakrishna saying, that the siddhis come in the course of spiritual work on yourself, but if you get them, don't use them, because it only leads to trouble.
Right. Well,
and Maharaji was like, he was. Some people thought of him as a miracle Baba, who did miracles all the time. But he was. I don't do anything, and I think that was sincere. He didn't. Stuff came through him and happened, and but it wasn't. He wasn't sitting around plotting about it.
And he wasn't manifesting vibhuti and creating trinkets for people and things like Satya Sai Baba.
The hallmark of Maharaji for me was this kind of quality of synchronicity.
Yeah.
Stuff would happen that was, if you thought about it, it was unaccountable in a natural situation. Things wouldn't happen that way unless, there was something else operating. But you couldn't tell what. And the other thing that was really the hallmark of his being was just this incredible love. And I remember sitting with him. He was rarely quiet, but there was one time we were sitting with him, and we were sitting near the bathrooms in the back of the ashram. And he had built a lot of bathrooms because he thought there were a lot of people that started coming after he left his body. They needed them. We're sitting out, and suddenly he gets quiet, and he's just like sitting there, almost like a rock. And I was kind of meditating, and he rarely, gave you space to meditate around him. It was always talking and throwing fruit and this and that. But the space around him, and it was just this incredible feeling of love. And I was feeling more love than I'd ever felt in my life from my parents or a lover or, anyone. And I opened my eyes and I realized everyone around there was feeling the same thing. And he was just radiating that.
Wow. We'll be right back at you after this brief but important announcement. Back in the mid-90s, when I really committed to my own health and recovery, one of the most important parts of that journey was getting into juicing. And I've had a bunch of different juices. I've gone through phases of doing juice fast, and then, now spending tons of money at the juice stores because I'm too busy and or lazy to do it myself. But I really believe that extracting the nutrients from nature's abundance of life-supporting plants is really critical to a health regimen. However, it's expensive and inconvenient, or it used to be. Enter our sponsor, Organifi. These guys make some fantastic powdered juice blends and superfood blends that are extremely potent, very well sourced, very pure, easy to use, delicious. And I've just been a fan of them for many years, so I'm really happy to talk about today's product of choice. It's called Organifi Red Juice. It's got 13 superfoods to support energy in a berry superfood drink. It's 100% certified organic. no caffeine necessary, and just 2 grams of naturally occurring sugar from the freeze-dried berries. The berry blend that's extremely nutrient-dense and antioxidant-rich. Tastes delicious in just plain water. You can literally stir it up with a spoon. So I like to use the Organifi Red Juice in that afternoon slump when I start to feel a lull or before a workout. Anytime I feel like I want another cup of coffee, but I probably shouldn't, is a time for Organifi Red Juice. It's also really convenient to use on the go. I'm here recording these plugs right now in Austin, Texas. I've got a bag of the little Organifi Red Juice packets, which is how I had one this morning. And so I really like the fact that they're not only very nutritionally dense, but they're easy to habituate into your life. It's not a hassle. It's not expensive. I don't have to go drop $14 for the same juice at a juice spot and waste the glass and the time and energy. I just walk into the kitchen, pop one of these in a cup, stir it up, and I am done. So that's Organifi Red Juice. If you want to check it out, I highly recommend that you do. And I can't guarantee, of course, because I don't know you personally, but I can almost guarantee that you're going to love it. And as you drink your first cup of Organifi Red, you're going to be thinking, damn, Luke hooked it up. Thank you, Luke. So you can thank me later. But first you have to go to Organifi.com/lifestylist. That's ORGANIFI, Organifi with an I, Organifi.com/lifestylist. And if you use the code lifestylist, you're going to save yourself 20% off. That's Organifi.com/lifestylist. And now back to the interview.
I get the sense, just from feeling into it, that toward the end of Ram Dass's life, as his speech became more limited, that he was starting to radiate in that same way.
Yeah. I think when he left his body, he, in Hawaii, every Monday was beach day. And he used to love to get into the ocean and just, he had like a life vest, and they had this wheelchair with balloon wheels, and they'd get him down into the water and he could float. And all of that, the gravitation of that paralyzed body was gone, and he could just float into the ocean. And he just called it the ocean of love. And I think that was what it felt like when he died. He went into that space.
Yeah. Wow. I'd like to back up into a little bit of the kind of doing this in a very nonlinear way, which
I guess the book is kind of nonlinear.
I guess it's just my style, but there have so many things that I've been curious about his journey. Having, as I said, listened to so many of his talks, but there's still things that popped up in the book. I was like, what? I never heard that story. I mean, I guess you lived that long. You're born in the 30s and you lived that long. There's going to be a lot of stories. But he talks a lot about his first experimentation with psilocybin. I'm assuming some of that was synthetic, and then also he did mushrooms, and then of course went into a lot of LSD use. Much of it was terrifying sounding to me. I mean, just reading that book, I'm like, I could probably never do LSD for the rest of my life and be pretty happy about it. I used to go see the Dead a lot and take acid in a very unconscious way. I mean, it's fun, it's fun for a few hours, and then not so fun for the last 4. But one thing that was interesting in the book was that he talked about in the early research, pre-India and all that they were working a lot with LSD. And then he also mentions in passing using DMT. And I didn't really hear him expand on that. I've not heard him explore that particular substance much, and I might have just missed it. So I'm curious if in the course of writing the book or just knowing him, if he had anything more to say about that. Because in my own experience and research, I've never done DMT, but have done quite a bit of ayahuasca and also 5-MeO DMT, and have benefited tremendously from those experiences done very consciously.
Yeah.
Did he have any experience with 5-MeO, the bufo toad, or DMT or ayahuasca? Do you happen to know?
I don't know. He did mention the toad slime stuff once, and he said he took such a big hit that he really needed help getting back from it.
Okay, yes, that would sound about right. Yeah. Okay, so
and the DMT, I don't think he did a lot of, but he definitely tried practically anything that came his way.
Right.
And, he describes taking out his little traveling pharmacy when he meets Maharaji, and Maharaji asks him about acid. But Maharaji said, you have medicine? And Ram Dass said, well, I've got some, this and that, but nothing that, he thought Maharaji had a headache and needed aspirin.
Right.
Because Maharaji said, for my head, Maharaji, medicine for my head. And finally, Maharaji said, the yogi medicine. And Ram Dass thought of, okay, he must mean the LSD.
Yeah.
And, but when he takes out that little pharmacy, he's got a little,
right.
STP and this and that, and, for going up and coming down.
You're getting into, by the way, what is probably my favorite story of all about RD and Maharaji. Would you continue with the LSD and Maharaji story? Because this one's fascinating to me.
Well, the first time, so Maharaji, Ram Dass gives him 4 of Owsley's White Lightning 305 microgram LSD doses.
Wow.
Each of which is enough to put a grown person, well over the moon. And Maharaji apparently takes all of them. But Ram Dass is sitting a little bit off to the side, and he sits watching Maharaji. He's worried about him, and nothing happens. And that was sort of the first blow to his premise that psychedelics were a spiritual path. And not that he ever denied that, because it had been the path of his opening. And then he went back to the States after learning yoga and doing this intense meditation. And he comes back to India about almost 2 years later, 2.5 years later almost. And at some point, Maharaji says, and he had, when he got to the States, he was thinking about Maharaji and that acid experience, and he wasn't sure that Maharaji might not have just palmed the acid and thrown it over his shoulder.
Right.
He had this doubt.
Yeah.
And he couldn't get rid of it. Sitting with it.
How could any human animal take that much acid and not show signs? I mean,
nobody I know.
300 micrograms in and of itself for any normal person would be a lot, let alone, a few of those. So,
yeah. And Ram Dass had a high tolerance by that time. So it was pretty strong and very pure acid, and it had been made specially for him by Owsley. So the second trip, Maharaji says, did you give me medicine last time? And Ram Dass said, yeah. And he said, did I take it? And Ram Dass said, I think so. And that is that moment, of doubt. And Maharaji says, got any more? And Ram Dass had 5 more pills, and one of them was tablets and one was broken. So, but Maharaji took the other ones, and he said, can I take water with it? Ram Dass said, yeah. And then he takes them one at a time, carefully puts them on his tongue, and acts like he's really enjoying them. And then he says, will it make me crazy? And he kind of goes under his blanket, puts his blanket over his head. And when he comes back up, he looks like his, eyes are rolling and his tongue is hanging out, and he looks completely mad. And then he stops, and he's just completely, pulling Ram Dass' leg. And it's completely, nothing happens again. Wow. And he's talking to people, and Ram Dass is sitting there watching him like a hawk and worried that he's killed his guru. But nothing.
Such an incredible story, because you unpack that and try to discern what could have transpired that would make that just physiologically, biologically possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Doesn't compute.
Yeah. And a theory on it, because I've pondered this before, because, there's always the experience of integration, right? So one might take a plant medicine journey or ceremony or a psychedelic and have some incredible insights and merge with all of consciousness and God and experience unconditional love and all these things that one could hope for. And then you come back and you're you again, mostly, right? There's you've been somewhere and it exists, but you also know you got to come back and empty the trash.
That was always the problem with psychedelics.
Sweep the floor, right? So in that story with him seemingly being unaffected by a large dose of LSD twice, I've figured that he must have been at such a high state of consciousness that experience of what we might experience as being high, quotes, to him was just his standardized modus operandi at that high state of consciousness. Because it seems to me that what some of these tools do, and maybe even more so with the illicit kind of street drugs, is they just sort of dampen the lower frequencies so that we are able to perceive what is already present, right?
Yeah, that's what Michael Pollan talks about in that How to Change Your Mind book, and about how it suppresses the parts of the mind that keep you rational, I guess. But most of the people the Westerners who saw Maharaji had gotten there through psychedelics. I certainly did. That was my original expectation when I went to see Ram Dass, was that he knew about that. And so at some point we asked Maharaji about it, and he said a number of things relevant to that. One being, he said that yogis in the Himalayas had known about such medicines, but the knowledge had been lost.
Really?
And then he said, it can take you into the room with Christ, but you can only stay for 2 hours. And he said, it's better to be Christ than just to go visit.
Oh, wow.
And then Ram Dass sometimes quoted that wonderful Alan Watts line of, when you get the message, hang up the phone.
Oh, that's great. So after receiving instruction like that, did you and your crew and Ram Dass, did you guys phase out of the experimentation with psychedelics quickly after you began going to India? Or was this something that went on for a period of time after that and just became integrated into your spiritual pursuits?
I can really only speak for myself. I know Ram Dass kept using psychedelics and smoking pot for some years. I think he finally completely stopped when he was living in Maui because one of the doctors, a Chinese herbalist and acupuncturist, said, "Look, I'm working on your brain here, and smoking pot is counteracting what I'm trying to do." So he stopped.
Right.
I think he got sort of clearer after that. For myself, I can only say that it sort of just fell away. I remember the last couple of acid trips that I took, which were, I think the last one was in India, actually. And I spent most of it coming down. It was getting, kind of difficult and hard coming back in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And less blissful.
Yeah.
I certainly have nothing against it. Obviously, the set and setting thing that Ram Dass and Leary really developed very thoroughly is so important to how you use things like that. If you're doing it for fun, and you're liable to, if you're not in situations that are conducive, that setting part, or if your mindset is not very clear about what your intentions are, you can get into trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that warning. I give that disclaimer a lot whenever covering those topics, because I've earlier in life had many experiences that were quite negative because they were just not well planned. And also my intention was to attempt to check out. Mm-hmm. But as you and anyone that's taken those type of substances knows, it really checks you in, right? So whatever's present, you're going to see it. And if you don't want to look inside, that would be definitely a wrong direction to head.
Well, I will say for myself that meditation has gotten more interesting than drugs at this point.
What's your meditation practice look like these days?
I don't know what it looks like. And I don't know what it is, actually. But we studied Vipassana meditation a lot in India. And that's a really useful practice. I've been leading a little meditation circle, basically, literally just ringing the bell and sitting with people at the local yoga center where I live. And of course, in COVID, that went on to Zoom. And I'm staying put. I'm not traveling at all still. And so I've been much more regular about it than I had been.
Oh, interesting.
And it's good. It's that practice is really, it's not called practice for nothing.
Yeah. And
so Go ahead. No, it's all right. It's I use mantra and breathing, breath meditation, and some semblance of Vipassana, and
got it.
I don't know what all.
Cool, awesome.
Whatever works.
Let's see. I think one thing that's really interesting in this journey is that you were really able to participate in the process of RD transitioning and dying. And I know he did so much work if anyone ever is dealing with death, the first thing I do is send them a bunch of podcasts or talks, of him exploring that. I think in our society, it's something that we really don't know how to deal with. We're very afraid of. It's just kind of, pushed behind the curtain, and we don't want to look at our mortality, I think, because maybe the Western mindset is more bent on the idea that we are mortal. Whereas in countries such as India, where this idea of reincarnation is more prevalent, death seems to be something that's much more out in the open. And I'm curious what your experience was being with someone as they died who had done so much work around exploring death as part of the human experience.
Well, he had done a lot more exploration of that than I had. But first, in the course of working with him, I had this once I was out working with him on Maui, and I'm out walking in the morning and my phone rings and I hear sirens in the background. And my 14-year-old daughter had been run over on her bicycle. And I got back to the house. And when we heard that she hadn't made it out of the trauma surgery, I looked at Ram Dass and I said, she didn't get to finish her life. I was just wrecked. And he looked at me straight in the eye and said, yes, she did. And that just minute shift of perspective to understanding that this is an incarnation. This is a birth. And, we are beings in the flesh, incarnation, in the meat. And then something else happens and it's a mystery. But the power of that at that moment just at least took me out of it being about me and my grief for a moment. And then I had to get back on a plane and go home and take care of and be with her body and my wife and my son. And it was, it's the worst thing that can happen to a parent.
Unimaginable.
And it's still with me. And then being with him over the years, that was in 2013, and he died in 2019, so that was 6 years later. And that's the only time being with him that I've been with somebody as they actually left their body. And it was profound. And it was, first there was this grief at losing someone that I'd known for 50 years, who had been my mentor and friend for that time. And then there was this feeling of kind of joy that he was out of that body, which was getting so difficult. And then the sense that his presence was very strongly there. So he certainly had less fear of death than anybody else I've known. He had looked at it. He had been with many people when they passed. He really sat with a lot of people, especially during the AIDS crisis in the late 80s. And that had started with his mother's passing back in 1967, early 67. And the degree of denial that he saw around her death really propelled him into re-examining how the culture deals with death. And he had really worked on that and created, ways for people to die more consciously and surrounded by a more spiritual environment.
Yeah. Wow. What an interesting experience. I don't think I've ever been around even a deceased person's body before that I recall. Maybe one brief open casket funeral a long, long time ago for someone that was just an acquaintance.
Yeah.
I thought an interesting part of this story of you being present for his passing there in Hawaii was that his body was kept in the premises for 3 days on ice.
Yeah.
Was that one of his dying requests, I would assume?
Yeah. He was very thoughtful about what he wanted to happen at his death. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there is a guy who, a Sufi teacher named Bodhi B on Maui, who has a death store, and he is an undertaker. But wow. They were trying to make death a much more continuous experience, and they were trying to get permission to have an open air cremation. Finally, the Hawaiian Health Department wouldn't give them a permit to do that. So Ram Dass was cremated at the local funeral home that had a crematory.
Well, what logistically went into a play in order to keep his body there for those 3 days? Did that require any
dry ice?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You and his other friends just pulled that together and made that happen? I'm so curious how that would even be possible or what it would have been like. It's just incredible.
It was okay. And people were, we kept him in his bedroom, his room upstairs, and he was lying out, and the guys that had taken care of him lovingly for years, some of them, washed his body and, really prepared the body. And this guy, Bodhi, supervised the whole process. And then after 3 days, he took the body and held it until we could get the cremation done.
Wow.
In a refrigerator, I guess. And
wow.
People were coming and meditating with his body for those 3 days. And it was very powerful, and chanting and just sitting. And the presence in that room was powerful.
Oh, I can imagine. What a unique experience. It's hard for me to put myself in that position, thinking about a longtime friend like that. It must have been really, really incredible for you. That's just such an interesting story.
Yeah, I don't feel like he's gone anywhere much.
You still feel his presence.
Yeah, and particularly, the book publication was such that basically I've spent the year after his death finishing the book. So I have been, kind of inhabiting his life in, a secondhand way. But
right, that's
his
interesting.
presence has been very much with me.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah, here I'm interviewing you, right, and we're talking
he
about
left me holding the bag.
Yeah. Wow, torch carrier. That's really cool. That's
well,
actually,
I'm just, part of the messenger service, I think.
If we could all be so lucky to have someone like you to carry on our legacy, honestly. There's one thing that I find really interesting about his journey and persona is that nowhere along the line did I perceive that he adopted a spiritual ego, that he got full of himself or started taking himself too seriously. He seemed to be able to maintain humility. And I think that was just largely demonstrated to me by his continued sense of humor. I find people that are very ego identified are very serious, and especially about themselves.
He didn't take himself that seriously. That's true.
Yeah. And he was so authentic about his continued neuroses in certain ways. Like one of my favorite things is he would talk about how he still bit his fingernails. And I always think that I'm not spiritual because I haven't been able to completely beat that habit yet, or I have a little relapse on nicotine for a while and I'm like, oh, we haven't made any progress, Luke. And I go, wait, Ram Dass did it, I
think those neuroses and habits and things just became less relevant. Yeah, I think that quality of lightness allowed other people to enter into the story with him also. That is a kind of an aspect that came from, his sense of humor could be biting at times too. Let's be, real about that. He sometimes was not sarcastic, but sharp. And that was fun. And we laughed a lot in the process of working on the book. Often just at the absurdity of our situations.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and he was able to appreciate that in his own story a lot.
Well, I think that really, in addition to his continued humility, was just the way that he seemed to be taking his physical limitations and going through that experience of the stroke. I mean, if anyone ever had an excuse to go into victimhood, martyrhood, etc., it would be in a situation like that. And, I don't know, you knew him intimately, but publicly facing, I never got the sense that he was feeling too sorry for himself about that experience and was able to find unique gifts in having had that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of those, nonverbal teachings of just observing someone like, they still seem happy, right? Yeah. And they're still able to carry themselves with some degree of lightness. And I think that's a really powerful demonstration of the teachings and really embodying them.
He hung them around for more than 20 years after the stroke. And it was not an easy time. And, his body was going downhill through a lot of that time. And because the paralysis never really let up from the stroke. Mm-hmm. And he had a lot of pain and he never complained. I mean, if I kind of asked him about, something specific, he would say, yeah, neuropathy in my feet is keeping me awake. I can't sleep very much. But he managed to coexist with that. And he talked about how he had come to love that stuff in himself also. And that to me is one of the great sort of parables of how to deal with your own stuff, my own stuff, is to try and love it, even when it's nasty and painful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not an easy one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I haven't managed to pull it off myself. I remember having sciatica and it just hurt.
Same here. Same thing. I mean, nothing to the degree that he's experienced, but all of us have our persistent little aches and pains, and that we want to fix. The human body's fallible, right? Protoplasmic, very vulnerable, machine that we're walking around in. And, it was really, really powerful to see him actually go through that and just continue on. And you get the sense with some beings such as he that, I don't know, on one level, if they really wanted to leave, they could leave.
I think I wouldn't have hung around as long as he did.
Yeah,
I mean, he did it for other people and more than
it's himself. A real testament to his commitment to service. Love, serve, remember. I think that's just one of the hallmarks of his work and life. Also, is just how deeply committed he was, working with prisoners, working with the dying. I mean, he didn't just talk about it; he actually did it, and it's a pretty tough act to follow. I think about myself and I go, well, I'm contributing. I have a podcast, but it's like, I'm not going to San Quentin and teaching, inmates how to meditate or some of the things that he did sitting in hospice with AIDS patients for years. And I mean, that's real. I guess to him, it wasn't a sacrifice, but that level of service is completely different than just being a nice person and being kind and compassionate on a day-to-day basis. I mean, he really did exemplify that principle in real life, which is just incredible.
He paid some dues.
Yeah. The last thing I want to ask you, and I don't know if this is an answerable question, but do you consider Ram Dass to have been an enlightened being? And would he have considered himself as such?
There's relatively enlightened compared to where I'm sitting. And yes, I consider him to, he was definitely further along than I am in my development. He always, what he shared was helpful to anybody, on a path. And he would address where you were in your own work. And I think that was one of the things he loved doing the most, actually, was sitting with people one-on-one and helping people along with their work. But, in the sense of a being who has completely finished their work, and people like Ramana Maharshi or Shirdi Sai Baba or Ramakrishna and Maharaji for me, and Nityananda, Muktananda's guru. Mm-hmm. Those beings are that quality of being both completely beyond and completely present in this reality at the same time. There wasn't a lot of somebody hanging around wanting anything in any of those beings. And Ram Dass still had stuff going on. And he was, was completely open about it mostly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's probably more of it than, some of his followers would like in this book.
No, I love it. I love it. Yeah. And
I think that quality of, immanent and transcendent at the same moment is such an interesting place to work with.
It is, and I think it's a great level to strive to. Also, I think a lot of spiritual seekers, including myself, especially in the beginning of the journey, thought that to really do this thing for real, if you really are pursuing enlightenment at the highest level possible, that you have to become a renunciate and just give up your earthly possessions and aspirations and desires and really just go do that and be with God. And then as some of us mature in that, you find that perhaps the goal might be closer to what you just described, where you have access to consciousness in that way and the love that is consciousness, but also here in the householder position doing podcast and doing your thing here,
kids and,
right? Yeah,
paying income tax.
exactly. Because I think in the beginning, when I was maybe a little less mature, I thought, well, if I don't have cities and I'm not enlightened, that I haven't done it right. And maybe, some of those beings that you just described that have been so remarkable and so unique and impactful, perhaps the creator has set things up so that it's a balanced energy on the planet or universally, where there's only a few of them around at any given time, right? And it seems to keep evolution going on at this, what seems to be a snail's pace in terms of human consciousness. But, if there were thousands of beings at that level, who knows, maybe the balance wouldn't be there. I have to arrive at the idea that either everything is perfect as it is, or it's not, right? It's God is everything or God is nothing. And so if I was meant to be an exalted mystic like that, well, I would be. But the fact that I'm still very human means that, I'm on the right path, and that perhaps there's no destination to become so enamored with.
Well, I think what those beings, I remember being with Ananda Maima a couple of times, a wonderful woman saint whose name translates as bliss-permeated mother. And she was kind of born that way. She came in as a manifestation of the divine mother or something. And they married her off, and her husband eventually became her, disciple.
Wow, that's crazy.
And she was incredible. It was like, just this deep field of like thick peace around her. But I think those beings show us that what's possible. Mm-hmm. And they're also, the ways that our minds try and conceptualize what that's about. They also show us that it's not conceptual.
Right. It ain't figure outable.
You can't achieve it. You can only kind of surrender into it in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, isn't that the crazy thing about spiritual pursuit, is that it's like, other than setting the intention, I guess it really is a yin process, right? It's those of us in the West are like, all right, let me read a book on enlightenment. I'm going to go out there and get her done. It's like,
I'm going to meditate until I'm done.
Yeah, it's an interesting goal to have, because it's one that is attained through surrender, as you said. And I think that the work that Ram Dass did, and the way that you've carried on, his legacy with this book is a really great example of that, of the ability to just allow yourself to be human, but also set your sights on the goal of at least moving upward in consciousness, right? And
well, thank you for saying that, but I really feel like his life is sort of a parable of using this stuff that comes to you as the material for your spiritual journey, and he really did that a lot, and that quality of love that he brought to it, I think, is perhaps the most powerful message that comes out of it. I know that he often quoted this Gandhi story about Gandhi's on a train, and he's just leaving this place that he's been visiting, and this reporter calls out to him just as the train's getting ready to pull out, and he said, "Gandhi ji, give me a message for your people." And Gandhi scrawls on a piece of paper and hands it out the window to him, and it says, "My life is my message."
Beautiful. Wow.
Don't know. I'm in the great land of I don't know.
That's amazing. That's a mic drop right there, my friend. That's great.
That's good.
That's a great way to wrap up a really fascinating and inspiring conversation. I'd like to ask you in closing, I guess a couple of them might be obvious, but feel free to get creative. I always ask my guests who 3 teachers or teachings in their life have been most influential that you might share with us.
Well, Ram Dass about being in the moment. Maharaji, I think, about unconditional love. And Ramana Maharshi, for me, who I never knew, and he was dead before I got to India or anything. That self-inquiry of just following your sense of identity inward, I think has been a very helpful process. But there's so many, beings who have given me hints, most of which I haven't followed. But
well, you followed enough of them. We made it here, man.
Yeah, we're here.
Thank you.
Where that is, who knows?
Thank you for that take. And in closing, everyone can find the book. I'm going to hold it up for our video viewers again. It's a very substantial book, by the way. I love a nice hardcover book. And this is one I'm going to be sitting with for quite a while. And you can find the book Being Ram Dass wherever books are sold. Do you have any websites or anything you want to send people to other than that?
Well, ramdass.org is the one that is kind of making his teachings available. A lot of his talks and you can get the book through the storefront there. And otherwise, use your local indie bookstore.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. It's really great to get to know you. And
likewise, Luke.
Yeah, thanks again for this contribution, man. I was so excited to see this come out, and then to get to have a conversation with you has been really fun. So thank you very much.
I hope Austin treats you well.
So far, so good, my friend. Yeah. 70 degrees and sunny today after a bit of an early winter right before we got here. So yeah, I'm feeling very at home, very grounded here. I just moved to a town outside of Austin of 15,000 people after 32 years in LA with 4 million people. So it's much appreciated space. Let's put it that way. So thank you so much for joining me today on the Lifestylist Podcast.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Likewise.
This was such an incredibly rewarding and inspiring conversation for me as someone who's followed Ram Dass's work for so long. And Ramesh is the guy to talk to if you want to talk about Ram Dass. I mean, frankly, they were friends for so long, and the 10 years that he put in to writing this incredible memoir, Being Ram Dass, made this conversation a real treat for me. So I trust that you enjoyed it with the level of enthusiasm that I did. And if you did, make sure to share it with a friend. I'd also like to invite you to follow me on Instagram @LukeStory. That's LukeStorey. And one of the best things about my Instagram channel, according to me, and hopefully a few other people like you, is that 99% of the time I live stream these conversations, even the ones that were done like this, remotely. So if you want to see the behind the scenes goings on, I recommend that you follow me there. I'd love to hear from you. I interact with so many listeners. I do my best to keep up with the direct messages and whatnot. I can't always respond to all of them, but it's a great way for me to get to know you. And while the censorship-laden, corporate-controlled big tech giants all fall before us eventually, for now, I am still using Instagram, although I'm absolutely in opposition to many of their policies. And well, we'll save that for another episode. I'm there, and I'm using the platform for now, and it'd be a great way to interact with you and get your feedback on episodes. And if you hear shows like this and they're inspiring and you want to share them, a great way to do that is posting them to your Instagram stories. And if you do so in a creative way, I'll probably repost your story and perhaps even get you some followers or help you to make some connections there. Because frankly, despite some of the misgivings I have around social media and big tech in general, due to their shady behavior, it still is a great way to foster community and to stay connected, especially in the times we face where social interactions are limited. So that's what's up on Instagram. I'd also like to invite you to next week's episode and get the name of our guest, Philipp Samor von Holzendorf-Fehling. Yes, he is a German gentleman. But despite the difficulty I have pronouncing his name at times, he was actually a great guest, and his English was on point, so it was very easy to communicate with him. And in that episode, we're talking about unlocking the mysteries of quantum technologies and EMF protection. So if you're someone like me who's spent a bunch of cash on these weird little stickers and medallions and pendants and things that are supposed to protect you from EMF, I mean, listen, I don't know if any of them work or not. I guess that most of them probably don't, but Philip has cracked the code on some of this technology, and I got to reach down here. Yeah, actually, I'm wearing one of his devices right now. And of all the things I found, I think that they are the most effective and definitely have the most quantifiable evidence supporting their efficacy. So we talk about all things quantum technology and dip into EMF protection a bit too. That'll be next Tuesday's show. And I look forward to having you join us there. And then I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. First up, we've got Element. These are some incredible electrolyte powdered drinks that make fasting and avoiding carbs and sugar way, way easier. You can find that at drinkelement.com/Luke. That's DRINKLMNT.com. Drinkelement.com/Luke. They're going to have a special offer for you over there where you can get some free stuff. How about that? And we've got Cacao Bliss from Mindful Health, and you can find that at earthechofoods.com/Luke Story. That's an incredible cacao-based superfood blend, and the code there is Luke15, and that gets you 15% off. Finally, we've got Organifi. That's Organifi.com/lifestylist. ORGANIFI, Organifi with an I/lifestylist. The code there is also lifestylist, and that gets you 20% off. And listen, I want to let you know that, at the end of the show, for those of you that still listen, when the plugs come, I know a lot of people probably tune out because who wants to listen to a commercial? But if you find any of these products intriguing and you want to check them out, and you're like, wow, that's a lot of URLs and a lot of codes. I know it's a lot of information. Every time I read them off, I'm like, wow, I would totally be tuning out right now, especially if I was in a car or something like that and didn't have the opportunity to write things down. So I'm going to make it easy for you to get your grubby little paws on some of our sponsors' high-quality health and wellness products. You can find them all, to keep it very simple, at lukestory.com/store. There you will find the past 5 years of my exploration into all of these products. I've curated a really amazing store there that is very carefully categorized. So if you want to work on sleep, there's a sleep section. If you want to work on fitness, there's a fitness section. If you want to know where to get organic groceries and grass-fed meats and wild fish and things like that, there's a section for that. There's a section for everything at lukestory.com/store. And all of these codes that I give you guys, because I always request, if not demand, quite frankly, that the companies that want to promote on the show offer you really nice discounts and promotions. You can also find all of these discount codes on the site as well. So when you find the product you want or you're looking for at lukestory.com/store, all you have to do is click on it and you'll see the discount code there. So everything is there. And in a similar way, depending on what app you use to listen to this podcast, you can also find these links and codes just by clicking on the show notes. So if you listen to this show on the Apple Podcast app, for example, there's extensive show notes there beneath the title of the episode that include the codes and the links. It's a little different for each podcast app, but just know that you can find them there too. That's what I use a lot. I was listening to, let me see the name of it. Hang on one sec. I've been obsessed with these interior design podcasts. I mean, podcasts are so amazing, right? Anything you want to learn about, you can learn about for free from a lot of people that really know their stuff. Where is it? It's called Inside Design with Kandrak and Cole. And I was listening to that and they were talking about these engineered wood floors or wallpaper or this certain kind of paint. And I was like, oh man, how am I going to remember that? So I thought, maybe they do it like I do. And sure enough, I scrolled down on that particular episode and there were the links and codes and all that stuff there. So we try to make it as convenient as possible for you to get what you want and at the same time support the show and the work that I'm doing here. So I always like to share any hacks for you that make all of this more simple, because I know it can be overwhelming when I'm throwing all this stuff at you. And if you don't want to buy any of that stuff, like I always say, man, if you really want to be healthy, I'll tell you straight up right now. And my sponsors might not like this, but honestly, that's not my belief. It's because beliefs are malleable. It's my experience, which makes it a fact to me at this point in my life that if you're drinking really clean water, and there's a lot of content around water. I've done a lot of shows about what I think the best water is, which is just absolutely pure, clean, high Rocky Mountain spring water. It's not always accessible to us, but you definitely don't want toxic water. But if you're drinking clean water, you're getting outdoors as much as possible, spending as little time indoors, getting natural sunlight on your body, in your eyes. I don't mean stare at the sun, unless, of course, you're doing sun gazing in the morning and evening safely. And there's an art and science to that in itself. But getting outside, undomesticating yourself, getting back to being a wild human, not eating poison sprayed on food. So eating organic food whenever possible. What else? Of course, moving your body in whatever way feels good to you, doing some joint mobility drills or exercises, doing high-intensity interval training a couple days a week, doing some intermittent fasting. Eating less is actually cheaper, it turns out. Eat less. That's what I attempt to do. What else is there? Paying attention to your EMF exposure. If you can't eliminate the EMF in your house and shield your bedroom, which would be, something that's not free. If you got Wi-Fi in your house, at least turn it off when you sleep. Keep it far away from your body when you're working or hanging out, watching TV, doing your thing. Definitely keep your router far away from your bed. My point here is that most of what I consider to be powerful health interventions have to do with just getting outdoors and interfacing with nature, getting your bare feet on the ground, watching that sunrise, watching the sunset, getting in really cold water, whether it's an ice bath or even better, a freezing natural body of water. Cut a hole in some ice at your local lake in the winter and dip in there every morning for a good 3 to 5 minutes. It will change your life. Doing breath work. Breath work is free, folks. Air is free. Well, unless you're somewhere that requires you to wear a toxic formaldehyde-laden mask that limits your oxygen and causes you to breathe back in carbon dioxide and loads of bacteria that have built up on said mask. But, get outdoors where there's fewer chemtrails and more fresh air. All the things that really make you healthy are free. And I always like to say that, a lot of people have the misconception that you have to spend all this money to be healthy. And maybe, honestly, if you're ill and you've lived a domesticated toxic lifestyle and you're paying the price now, yeah, you might have to spend some money. Go get some ozone, do this, do that, get a sauna, PEMF, red light therapy. I mean, there's a lot of interventions that are very expensive. And even if you're a well person, they can really maximize your health and vitality. But, I just want you to know that you don't have to buy the stuff that I plug on the show. It's for people that want to go next level, people that have a little bit of disposable income on hand and also want to support the show in that way. But I am a huge proponent of being your own healer, using your intuition, listening to your body as a part of who you are. In the teachings of Ram Dass and many of the masters like him, we of course learn that we are not our body, which is a huge shock to us at the beginning of our spiritual journey. We go, wait, these thoughts I have aren't me? This body that I have is not me. There's a me that's inhabiting this body. There's a me that's witnessing these thoughts and these feelings and sensations, which was a huge breakthrough for me and continues to be something that I continually practice and remind myself. Yet at the same time, we are our body because our energetic blueprint or soul or spirit inhabits this body, and we can learn to love it and communicate with it and ask it what it needs and what it doesn't need. And some bodies might want a bunch of supplements and superfoods and high density nutrition at one time and want a break at another time, which is not something I typically do, but I like the idea of it. I try to cycle my supplements and things like that. So there's a little pep talk on health and supplements for you at the end of the show for those of you still listening. And if you are still listening, I truly appreciate you, your kind attention, your ears. I know time is so valuable, even though it's an infinite resource in each body that we incarnate into. We do have a finite time here in this body. And so while we're here, that time becomes valuable. And I appreciate you spending it with me and our incredible guest, Rameshwar Das. I'll see you next week.